Worked so hard to build. I called the sheriff's office to report the trespassing. A deputy came out, wrote down my statement, and promised to issue warnings. A few days later, I even saw him pull Karen over near my gate, and I thought maybe that would be enough to stop her. But the very next morning, she was back again, barreling through with that same grin plastered on her face. It became clear to me that warnings and polite words weren't going to work. Karen wasn't the type to listen to reason or respect boundaries. She saw my property as her playground, and she thought her title as HOA president made her untouchable. I realized that if I wanted this to stop, I had to take matters into my own hands. Not with violence or shouting matches, but with something she wouldn't see coming, proof. Ironclad, undeniable evidence of her arrogance. So I came up with a plan. I bought a set of trail cameras, the kind hunters use in the woods, motion activated and built to withstand weather. I placed them strategically along the fence line, hidden in brush and on posts, all linked straight to my phone. That way, every time she or anyone else drove through, I'd have video proof. But I didn't stop there. I reinforced the section of fence she always targeted with heavy-duty steel posts and angled barriers. On the outside, it looked like the same old wooden fence she'd driven through countless times, but hidden inside was a wall of solid steel waiting for anyone arrogant enough to try it again. I worked all weekend, hammering posts, welding plates, and disguising it with wood so it would blend perfectly. By the time I was finished, it looked just like the rest of the fence. To Karen, it would seem like nothing had changed. But I knew the truth, my fence wasn't a weak barrier anymore. It was a trap, not to hurt her, but to teach her a lesson. If she tried to plow through again, her car would take the damage, not my land. And thanks to the cameras, I'd have every second of it recorded. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. For once, I wasn't dreading the sound of tires crunching through my pasture. Instead, I was waiting for it. I knew Karen wouldn't be able to resist. She was too arrogant, too sure of herself, too determined to prove she was in control. Sooner or later, she would come back. And when she did, the fence she had mocked so many times would finally fight back. 2 mornings later, just as the sun was rising over the valley, I heard it, the rumble of an SUV engine in the distance. My phone buzzed with motion alerts, and I opened the feed to see her silver SUV approaching the same spot. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, my heart pounding with anticipation. She didn't even hesitate. With total confidence, she aimed straight at the fence and hit the gas. In seconds, the impact echoed across the valley. Wood splintered, steel groaned, and her SUV crumpled in on itself with a metallic shriek. Steam poured from the hood as her car screeched to a halt, trapped halfway through my fence line. I watched it all live on my phone, every angle captured perfectly. For the first time, it wasn't my fence that was broken. It was Karen's pride, and her car. And I knew this was only the beginning of her downfall. The moment the dust settled, Karen stumbled out of her SUV like someone waking from a bad dream, clutching at her chest and shouting curses that barely made sense over the hissing steam. Her sunglasses were crooked, one headlight hanging loose, and the front bumper looked like it had been through a meat grinder. She glared at me with a mix of fury and disbelief that was almost comical, like the universe had suddenly shown her a mirror and she didn't like the reflection. "You'll pay for this," she screamed, slamming her palm against the warped hood as if she could somehow reverse physics with righteous outrage. "This is a setup. You trapped me. This is illegal." Around her, the wrecked fence looked shamefully neat compared to the way her pride had been shredded. I walked up the dirt path toward her slowly, not because I was afraid of what she might do, but because I wanted every neighbor who'd gathered at the road to see what happened next. Word travels fast on a ranch, and by the time I reached the gate, half a dozen folks had already stepped out of their houses, drawn by the sound of the crash. Some had lawn chairs, some were still in their slippers. Nobody moved to help her. The mood was more one of astonished curiosity than sympathy. "Sir, we need the sheriff," one neighbor called, though I'd already flicked a text to the county dispatcher as soon as the cameras pinged me. The little red notification had popped on my phone and I'd hit send before Karen's SUV even stopped smoking. She coasted down the dirty slope of entitlement and smugness straight into a real problem, and now she had to explain herself. The first deputy arrived within minutes, lights flashing, and when he stepped out he didn't even bother to hide his irritation. He'd seen this neighborhood's drama before and it rarely ended well. He asked for my statement and then, to Karen, he asked a question she had no good answer for. "Ma'am, can you explain why you were driving through private property again?" Her answer was the kind of malarkey she always relied on, half-truth, half-bluster, entirely self-serving. "I'm the HOA president," she said. "This is community access. There's no harm. He should have put up a sign." The deputy cut her off with a flat look. "You were warned. You have vehicle damage and fence damage on your record now. We have video. There's going to be a report." Her voice went up an octave then, and she started promising lawyers and lawsuits and how she'd make me pay for the booby trap I'd set. It was as if she believed threats could reassemble ducts and steel. I handed the deputy my phone and the feed played back in clear, humiliating detail, weeks of her and others using the gap, the exact moment of impact, the way she ignored the signs, the license plate numbers of other cars that had followed her. The deputy's eyes scanned the footage and his pen scratched on the notebook in a way that said this was going to stick. "We'll document the damage, contact her insurance, and forward this to the county prosecutor if needed," he told me. "You did the right thing by recording everything." Karen's protests turned to sputters. When the tow truck finally hauled her SUV away with a clanging groan, she climbed into the passenger seat, still steaming with indignation. People on the road snapped photos with their phones and some of the younger neighbors even live-streamed. By evening the story had already spread to the small local news circle. The HOA's phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree the next day. Residents called to complain, some siding with Karen, a surprising number siding with me, and the board scrambled to hold an emergency meeting. I wasn't eager to step into a hornet's nest, but when the call came, I agreed to attend. It was clear the HOA was trying to perform damage control. Their first instinct was to protect their boss. But once I walked into the community hall and put my phone up on the projector, the whole dynamic changed. The footage plays differently when dozens of neighbors have a chance to see it in the light. No bluster, no excuses, just undeniable evidence of repeated trespassing and reckless behavior. People murmured and then openly talked about their own bad experiences, stories of fines without notice, of late-night inspections and petty rules enforced with an iron fist. There was an honesty in the room that felt like sunlight peeling back grimy wallpaper. The board tried to meet her halfway. Some wanted to call it a misunderstanding and negotiate repairs, but those were the same voices that had once been afraid to confront her. The montage of people's testimonies made it impossible to salvage her image. By the end of the night, the board had no choice. She was temporarily suspended pending an investigation, and the county was notified about potential criminal charges for trespassing and property damage. The applause that followed wasn't for me, it was for the community reclaiming its dignity. Of course, Karen fought back. She filed a claim with her insurance and a civil suit claiming entrapment and malicious property damage. Her lawyer's filing sounded like a desperate attempt to rewrite cause and effect. She claimed the fence was a hidden hazard and that I'd deliberately sabotaged her. My lawyer, who smelled the weakness in her case, filed back with the security footage and the maintenance receipts, plus testimonies from neighbors who'd repeatedly complained to the HOA about her behavior. When the insurance company investigated, they quickly ruled that her vehicle damage was the proximate result of her repeated illegal entry. Coverage for willful trespassing was shaky territory. The civil suit fizzled when the judge reviewed the surveillance clips and the deputy's report. "There isn't evidence of entrapment," the judge wrote. "There is consistent evidence of trespass and willful recklessness. The legal system in this instance sided with property law and common sense." The fallout wasn't only legal, it was social and financial. Neighbors who had once allowed her to dictate tiny details of their lives began to speak up publicly. A few sought reimbursement for fines she'd levied for petty violations, and a small group organized to audit the HOA's finances. As volunteers combed through ledgers, odd payment records and questionable expense accounts turned up, things that had been hidden under the guise of community maintenance. Whether those lines would translate into criminal charges remained to be seen, but the board could no longer cover for her. She was removed from the presidency, and the HOA entered a period of forced transparency that made many residents breathe easier. My fence needed repair. We replaced the broken posts and bolstered the area where she had smashed through, but the repairs were a small price to pay for the restoration of peace. Insurance covered part of the cost after the deputy's report was filed against the trespassers, and neighbors who witnessed the crash helped with wooden labor. There was an odd, gratifying camaraderie in that, a bunch of people who'd been cowed by fear for years finally doing what felt right, passing around hammers and laughter instead of whispered complaints. Kids who once dared each other to drive through the gap learned a different lesson: boundaries matter. Months later, When the valley had settled back into its rhythms, I'd catch glimpses of change that never would have happened otherwise. The HOA board restructured its bylaws, installing a transparent complaints process and a clear, enforced policy against unauthorized access to private property. Karen moved away. Rumors said she couldn't handle the scrutiny, and her social media, once full of bravado, quieted into obscurity. People still remembered her, but now with the bemused pity reserved for those whose arrogance outlived their usefulness. Every so often, a new driver missed a turn and found themselves at my gate. I'd wave them in or direct them to the public road, and I'd notice the little flinch when they saw the heavy steel posts I'd installed. It felt good to stand there, as much a protector of my own peace as of my land. If anyone asked how I'd managed to stop the trespassing, I'd tell them honestly, patience, planning, and the willingness to let consequence do the work arrogance never can. The wrecked SUV had been a hard lesson for one entitled HOA president, but it became a turning point for the whole neighborhood, proof that private property has power, and that sometimes, a stubborn fence is the loudest kind of justice.